Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Once upon a time in the depths of winter, with snowflakes gently drifting down like feathers, a queen sat sewing by a window with a black ebony frame. As she stitched and watched the snow, she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell onto the white snow. The crimson against the white looked so striking that she wished for a child. I wish I had a daughter as white as snow, as red as blood, and with hair as black as the ebony frame. Soon after, she gave birth to a little girl who was as white as snow, red as blood, and whose hair was as black as ebony. They named her Little Snow White. Tragically, the queen died shortly after the child was born. A year later, the king married again. His new wife was stunningly beautiful, but also terribly proud and arrogant. She couldn't stand the thought of anyone being more beautiful than her. She owned a magical looking glass, and whenever she stood before it, she would ask, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The mirror always answered, "My queen, you are the fairest of all." This satisfied her, for she knew the mirror always spoke the truth. But Snow White was growing up, becoming more and more beautiful. By the time she was 7, she was as lovely as the day, and even more beautiful than the queen herself. One day the queen asked her mirror again, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The mirror replied, "My queen, you are lovely, that is true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen was stunned and turned sickly pale and green with envy. From that moment on, whenever she looked at Snow White, a wave of hatred swelled in her heart. Her envy and pride festered like a toxic weed, giving her no peace day or night. She summoned a huntsman and commanded, "Take the child deep into the forest. I can't stand to look at her anymore. Kill her, and bring back her lung and liver as proof." The huntsman obeyed. He took Snow White away, but as he drew his knife to strike the innocent girl, she began to cry. "Please, dear huntsman, spare my life. I promise I'll run away into the deep woods and never come home." Because she was so beautiful, the huntsman felt pity. "Run away then, you poor child," he said. He thought to himself, "The wild animals will surely devour her soon anyway," but a great weight lifted from his chest now that he didn't have to kill her. Just then, a young wild boar ran by. He quickly stabbed it, cut out its lung and liver, and took them to the queen as evidence of Snow White's death. The cook was ordered to prepare them, and the wicked queen ate them, believing she had consumed Snow White's organs. Meanwhile, the poor child was utterly alone and terrified in the vast forest. She ran and ran, scrambling over sharp rocks and through thorns, and though wild animals passed by, none of them harmed her. She ran until her legs gave out, just as evening was approaching. She saw a tiny cottage and slipped inside to rest. Everything in the cottage was miniature, but immaculately neat and clean. There was a table set with a white cloth, 7 small plates, 7 little spoons, 7 tiny knives and forks, and 7 miniature mugs. Against the wall stood 7 little beds lined up, covered with snow-white quilts. Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she took a bit of vegetables and bread from each plate and a sip of wine from each mug. Not wanting to take all of one thing, feeling exhausted, she tried the little beds, but none of them felt right. One was too long, another too short. Finally, the 7th bed was perfect. She settled in, said a prayer, and fell fast asleep. When it was completely dark, the owners of the cottage returned. They were 7 dwarfs who spent their days mining for ore in the mountains. They lit their 7 candles, and as the cottage brightened, they realized someone had been there because things were not as they'd left them. "Who's been sitting in my chair?" the first one grumbled. "Who's been eating off my plate?" the second asked. "Who's been taking some of my bread?" the third said. Who's been eating my vegetables? The fourth exclaimed. Who's been using my fork? The fifth wondered. Who's been cutting with my knife? The sixth asked. Who's been drinking from my mug? The seventh finished. Then the first dwarf looked at his bed. Who's been getting into my bed? He called out. The others rushed over, each shouting, Someone's been lying in mine too. But when the seventh dwarf looked at his bed, he saw little Snow White fast asleep. He called the others, who rushed up, gasping in astonishment. They brought their 7 candles closer, letting the light fall on Snow White. "Oh my goodness, what a beautiful child!" they cried. They were so delighted they didn't wake her, letting her sleep peacefully. The 7th dwarf slept with his companions, spending an hour in each of their beds to get through the night. When morning came, Snow White woke up and was startled to see the 7 dwarfs. But they were friendly and asked her name. "My name is Snow White," she replied. "How did you find our house?" asked the dwarfs. She told them her stepmother had tried to have her killed, the huntsman had spared her life, and she'd been running all day until she found their home. The dwarfs offered, "If you'll take care of our house, cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit, and keep everything tidy and clean, you can stay with us and you'll have everything you need." "Yes, with all my heart," Snow White said. So she stayed with them and kept the house in order. In the mornings the dwarfs went to the mountains to look for copper and gold, in the evenings they returned, and their supper had to be ready. The girl was alone all day, so the good dwarfs warned her. "Beware of your stepmother, she'll soon find out you're here. Don't let anyone in." Meanwhile, the queen, certain she had eaten Snow White's lung and liver, believed she was once again the fairest of all. She went to her looking-glass and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The glass answered, "My queen, you are lovely, that is true. But over the hills with the 7 dwarfs in their dwelling, Snow White is still alive and well, and 1,000 times fairer than you." She was horrified. She knew the mirror never lied. The huntsman had betrayed her, and little Snow White was alive. The queen plotted and schemed how she could finally kill Snow White, for she would have no peace as long as she wasn't the fairest in the land. When she finally hatched a plan, she disguised herself. She painted her face and dressed up like an old peddler woman so completely that no one could recognize her. In this disguise she traveled over the 7 mountains to the dwarf's cottage. She knocked on the door and cried, "Pretty things for sale, very cheap, very cheap." Snow White looked out the window. "Good day, good woman, what are you selling?" "Good things, lovely things," she replied, holding up a brightly colored silk staylace. "I suppose I can let this respectable old woman in," thought Snow White. She unbolted the door and bought the pretty laces. "Child, you look a fright. Come, I'll lace you up properly for once," the old woman said. Snow White, having no suspicion, stood still and let the woman lace her with the new staylaces. But the old woman was so quick and laced her so tightly that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if dead. "Now I am the most beautiful," the queen said to herself, and she hurried away. It wasn't long before the 7 dwarfs came home that evening. They were horrified to see their dear little Snow White lying on the ground, lifeless and still. They lifted her up, saw she was laced too tightly, and cut the laces. She began to breathe a little, and after a while she came back to life. When the dwarfs heard what happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was none other than the wicked queen. Be more careful, and don't let anyone in when we're not home." The wicked woman, once home, stood before her glass and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And it answered just as before, "My queen, you are lovely, that is true. But over the hills with the 7 dwarfs in their dwelling, Snow White is still alive and well, and 1,000 times fairer than you." When she heard this, fear and rage boiled in her blood. Snow White was alive again. "Now," she declared, I will devise something that will truly finish her." Using witchcraft, which she understood well, she made a poisonous comb. Then she disguised herself again, taking the appearance of a different old woman. She went over the 7 mountains to the dwarf's house, knocked, and cried, "Good things for sale, cheap, cheap!" Little Snow White looked out. "Go away, I can't let anyone in." "I suppose you can look, though," the old woman said, pulling out the poisoned comb and holding it up. The comb was so beautiful that the girl was tempted. She opened the door. Once they had made a deal, the old woman said, "Now I will comb your hair perfectly for once." Poor Snow White had no suspicion, and let the old woman have her way. But as soon as the comb touched her hair, the poison took effect, and the girl fell down senseless. "You perfect beauty," the wicked woman sneered. "You're finished now," and she left. Fortunately, it was almost evening, and the 7 dwarfs came home. Seeing Snow White lying as if dead, they instantly suspected the stepmother. They checked and found the poisoned comb. They barely had time to pull it out before Snow White came to her senses and told them what had happened. They warned her again to be on her guard and open the door for absolutely no one. The queen, back home, stood before the glass and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The mirror answered as before, "My queen, you are lovely, that is true. But over the hills with the 7 dwarfs in their dwelling, Snow White is still alive and well, and 1,000 times fairer than you." When she heard the mirror's words, she shook and trembled with uncontrollable rage. "Snow White must die," she screamed, "even if it cost me my own life." She went to a secret, isolated room where no one ever went and created a very poisonous apple. It looked beautiful on the outside, white with a tempting red cheek, so everyone who saw it would desire it. But anyone who ate even a bite was sure to die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and dressed up as a farmer's wife. She traveled over the 7 mountains to the dwarf's cottage. She knocked on the door. Snow White poked her head out the window. "I can't let anyone in." The 7 dwarfs forbade it. "It's no matter to me," the woman replied. "I'll be rid of my apples soon enough. Here, I'll give you one." "No," said Snow White, "I can't take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" the old woman taunted. "Look, I'll cut the apple in 2, you eat the red half and I'll eat the white." The apple had been cunningly prepared so that only the beautiful red half was poisoned. Snow White couldn't resist the beautiful apple, and seeing the woman eat a piece of it, she finally gave in. She reached out and took the poisonous half. The moment a piece of it touched her mouth, she fell down dead. The queen looked at her with a terrible, wicked look, laughed out loud and said, "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony, this time the dwarfs can't wake you up again." When she asked the looking-glass at home, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" it finally answered, "My queen, in this land you are the fairest of all." Only then did her jealous heart find a semblance of peace, as much peace as such a heart can ever know. When the dwarfs came home that evening, they found Snow White lying on the ground. She was no longer breathing, she was dead. They lifted her up, searched for anything poisonous, unlaced her, combed her hair, and tried everything, but it was all useless. The poor child was dead and remained dead. They laid her on a bier and sat around her, weeping for 3 whole days. They were preparing to bury her, but she still looked completely alive with her lovely red cheeks. "We can't bury her in the dark earth," they decided. Instead, they had a transparent glass coffin made so she could be seen from all sides. They laid her inside, inscribed her name and title as a king's daughter in gold letters, and placed the coffin high on the mountain. One of them always stayed there to guard it. Even birds came to mourn Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and finally a dove. Snow White lay in the glass coffin for a long, long time, and she didn't decay. She looked only as if she were sleeping, as white as snow, as red as blood, and with hair as black as ebony. One day, a prince came into the forest and stopped at the dwarf's house for the night. He saw the coffin on the mountain and the beautiful Snow White inside, reading the golden inscription. He pleaded with the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin, I'll give you anything you ask for it." But the dwarfs answered, "We wouldn't sell it for all the gold in the world." Then he begged, "Give it to me as a gift, I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and cherish her as my dearest possession." Because he spoke with such sincerity, the good dwarfs took pity on him and gave him the coffin. The prince instructed his servants to carry it away on their shoulders. As they walked, they stumbled over a tree stump. With a sudden jolt, the poisonous piece of apple that Snow White had bitten off was dislodged from her throat. Her eyes fluttered open, she lifted the lid of the coffin, sat up, and was alive again. "Oh my goodness, where am I?" she cried. The prince, overjoyed, rushed to her. "You are with me." He told her everything that had happened and said, "I love you more than anything in the world. Come with me to my father's palace, you shall be my wife." Snow White happily agreed and went with him. Their wedding was held with great pomp and splendor. Snow White's wicked stepmother was also invited to the feast. After dressing in her finest clothes, she stood before the looking-glass and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The glass answered, "My queen, you are lovely, that is true. But the young queen is 1,000 times fairer than you." The wicked woman let out a curse and was so distraught, so utterly miserable, that she didn't know what to do. At first, she decided not to go to the wedding at all, but she couldn't find peace. She was consumed by the need to see the young queen. When she walked in, she recognized Snow White instantly and stood paralyzed with rage and terror. But iron slippers had already been placed on the fire. They were brought in with tongs and set before her. She was forced to put on the red-hot shoes and dance until she dropped down dead. The end.